Well, hello and welcome to another SOLAS webinar. Excited to have you joining us today. I'm Andy Bannister, the director of the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity, and I'm thrilled to be joined all the way, quite literally all the way from the other side of the world, by an old dear friend, John Dickson. John, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Andy. It has been too long since we've chatted. So if this professional opportunity gives us an opportunity to catch up personally, I'm all for it.
Well, one thing I was reflecting on just looking at us there, John, I recall the last time you and I met, both of us had slightly less in the way of grey hair. So that probably shows that it was a few years, not that many years ago, but 7 or 8 years ago. Well, for those who don't know, John is one of these people, you've got quite a long kind of resume because you're into all kinds of stuff. You are an author, a speaker, historian, written about 20 books. You've recently, or relatively recently, started podcasting with the Undeceptions kind of podcast, and we'll put links to John's website and to the podcast and everything else in the show notes. Is there anything else I've missed, John? You're also a musician, right? I think as well. You're also sort of
sure.
Man of many.
Yeah, I mean, I started out as a musician, and sometimes I feel it was the best thing I ever did. So it's all been downhill since I was about 25.
Well, one of the things I liked about the book we're about to talk about, when Zondervan, your publisher, sent me through the review copy, it's the only time I've ever received a playlist with the book as well, which I thought was interesting.
Have you listened to the playlist? I spent hours about.
I know. I confess not all of it, but bits of it. I was like, this is actually quite impressive. More folks should do this. On which note, we are going to be talking with John on this over the next half hour about his relatively new book, the last few months, I think, isn't it? Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history. And again, lots of links in the show notes to different places where you can pick up John's book. And John, I read this when it first came out, and I don't just say this to everyone I interview, but it was a brilliant book, because I think there've been lots of individual books exploring the issue of the good and bad of Christian history, but the way you pull them all together, all the themes together, and package it in one resource is amazing. But I guess the first question I'd put to you about Bullies and Saints is, why the need to write the book? Why particularly this? You've written on many topics you could have written on. What led you to tackle this one as your next project?
I feel like saying it was partly therapy, because of course I mean, I've studied ancient history for a long time, and the intersection with church history is obvious, and I've always known that there are some really dark things in the church's past. Lots of bodies buried there in the churchyard. And I really wanted to work through them in a systematic way. But that coincided with doing a lot of pub work, fielding people's questions. And in particular, a major debate back in 2008 on the topic, we'd be better off without religion, that was broadcast here on the ABC, our national broadcaster. I was involved behind the scenes in the debate, and we lost the debate. The people arguing that we would be better off without religion overwhelmingly won. And I came away that night thinking, why is it that so many thoughtful people think that we'd be better off without Christianity? And that just sort of set me on a journey to really plumb the depths of it. And it seems to me that we can't plumb the depths of it without being super honest about the best and the worst of Christian history. So partly therapy, partly wrestling with this contemporary criticism of the church prompted me to write this book over the last 10 years.
One thing I really appreciate about the book actually is that honest part, because I read a review recently by a fairly prominent atheist blogger. I read lots of atheist blogs, so I actually forget who it was, but one fairly prominent atheist blogger had written a review, and they picked up on the same thing, that you really don't shy away from the difficult bits. I mean, there can be a temptation, right, for Christians sometimes to sort of skip over those, push them under the carpet, pretend they're not there, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great temptation. And, in some ways, it's going to be natural that we want to sort of cry out from the hilltops that Christianity is beautiful things. But the church has done some terrible things, and done them in Christ's name, and they're a matter of historical record. And so to be honest about that seems to me to be profoundly Christian. Christianity doesn't believe that we're inherently good. Christianity believes that we're fallen creatures, and that's true of the church. And it was Jesus who said, "Take the log out of your eye, and then see clearly." And so I think of the book as partly an attempt to identify the log in the eye of the church, and to address it without simply being negative. You know, I was really worried when I wrote the book that my co-Christian evangelicals, conservatives, would think that I'm letting the team down by having so much sort of about the dirty laundry of the faith. And as it's played out, the only criticism I've had for the book has come from more conservative Christians rather than the atheists or even Catholics. A major Catholic magazine reviewed the book really favourably. They didn't like my chapter on child sexual abuse scandals. Understandable, I guess. But they liked everything else. Anyway, so I knew I would be criticised from my own right flank, as it were. And I just have to put up with that. And the process of writing this, researching and writing this, has crushed any sort of Christian triumphalism I ever might have had, because there's a lot of darkness in there, even amongst people who are formally, officially saints of the church. There is dark stuff there, and we just need to own up to it.
Yeah, I think that's very, very helpful. And as you talk there, one of the things that I think struck me as I read the book was that as Christians we don't, in a sense, perhaps need to be defensive of the church, because the message of the gospel is not the church is going to be perfect, which is an interesting contrast with, say, Islam, which is my academic specialty. Whereas if you believe that you have the revealed law that's perfect and that you are the perfect people and the perfect nation and all the kind of language the Quran at times uses of Islam, you do sort of end up with this having to defend the team a bit more. Whereas Christians should actually be people who are willing to go, it's Christ we defend. We recognize that the team itself can sometimes be problematic. So we shouldn't have to feel that need, I think.
People have often said to me, and again, this is Christians usually, "Oh, you talk about, the Crusades and how the Crusaders slaughtered Muslims, but why don't you talk about, all the Muslim atrocities, that precede the Crusades, right?" And at one level, sure, if this were a straight history, you could do that. But the thing is, my reply is, but Muslims don't even claim to follow someone who said, "Love your enemy, turn the other cheek, do to others as you'd have them do to you." That's not the Islamic ethic.
Yeah.
Christians are the ones who follow the crucified Lord. So there's no point trying to say, do a kind of whataboutism. Look how bad they were.
Well, that's the temptation, isn't it? And I think my other comment, just before we leave the Crusades, would be that one can debate, as you say, politically whether it was the right move. That's a whole other discussion. But I look at it and go, whoever first had the idea of painting the cross, a symbol of forgiveness and love and compassion, onto military hardware and using that as your symbol as you did that, I mean, that's a travesty, absolute travesty. And so to tease those two issues apart, the political question and the theological one. One question I wanted to ask, John, before we kind of dive into a bit of the content from the book is there a sense in which this question has come more to the fore now? I'm intrigued how the questions that I get from skeptics shift over the years. And I can think 15, 20 years ago, much more sciencey type questions. It was the era of the new atheism, Dawkins and others. And so lots of questions about science and stuff. This question was there on the periphery, but I think it's come much more into the foreground now. Is there something going on in culture right now that means this is perhaps one of the top questions, and thus Christians need to be thinking about how we engage it?
I do think so, and it's not just a justification for my book, but our culture has become super sensitive to my rights, super sensitive to the vulnerable, the rights of the vulnerable. The sort of the authentic self needs to be nurtured, needs to be honoured, and anything that sort of crosses over that or tramples it down is seen as a great wickedness. And this emerging sense of protecting my rights and protecting the rights of the vulnerable coincides with the church being exposed for incredible evil in the child sexual abuse scandals, where I end the book. of the 20th century, which really only came to light in the late 90s and early 2000s, and came to terrible, blistering light in the Australian Royal Commission into child sexual abuse and institutional cover-ups, which is now the world's most detailed study of the whole phenomenon, and it's exposed the church. So yes, all of those things, and I think I would probably add the same-sex marriage debate and the argument that you're doing harm. This Christianity harms vulnerable people, and now the transgender debate. The powerful argument against the church is that the church is going to harm people, going to cause kids to suicide, and so on. So it's all part of this same mood of a dangerous church. And one could also probably find precedents in sort of critical studies, which sort of interpreted everything as power. And you turn to the church, it seemed to have had power for a long time, and therefore it's time to bring it down. All of those things coalesce.
That's very helpful. Thanks for that, John. So turning to the sort of meat of the book, there's so many things we could talk about because you just cover so much history in those 300 pages. But what about we explore it a bit this way? As you looked across the sweep of Christian history, and you looked at heroes and you've looked at bullies, who would be perhaps your standout hero? Maybe one that you hadn't really sort of thought much about until you came across them. So let's start with the heroes. As you went through Christian history, who stands out for you as what a character? If more of the church was like that, it would have been very different.
Oh, I only get one.
I know. I was going to say I'm a bit naughty.
I'm gonna give you two.
You may go.
You can edit me out if you.
Oh, no. We'll allow you to. And you've asked you for one, you give me two. If I asked you for two, you give me three, you see. So go on then, two.
Yeah, but I've just thought of a third. Anyway, I'd say Bishop Eligius, who was a French bishop in the 600s, AD 600s. And he was the most famous jeweler in Europe. He was making jewelry for all the royal, he got all the royal contracts. He became an extremely wealthy man. But he also used to read the sacred books, the Gospels and St. Augustine and so on, while he made his precious metals. And he eventually felt the impact of that so much that he felt bad about his wealth at the expense of others. And he started to, and we have a biography of him that's written within 5 years of his death, and so we're very close contact with him. He would go out in this sort of almost royal regalia, because he was dressed in jewels from head to toe. But he would go out on business trips and give away all of his clothing and come back in his sort of sack, his undergarment. And he would do this regularly because he couldn't bring himself to keep all the gold and the silver. And he eventually started to use all of his money, vast wealth, to free slaves. So we're in the 600s, right? In France, there were still slaves left over from the Roman slave system. There was a Saxon slave system as well. I mean, slavery was everywhere, right? And he couldn't bear it. And he and his disciples would go and free slaves. They'd hear wherever in Europe slaves were being sold. They'd go and they'd use his vast wealth to purchase them and set them free. And he actually said, you can either join us or you can go back to your home, and here's money for you to get home. And he did this on a vast scale. He eventually became a priest and eventually became a bishop and was one of the most loved men in Europe. And it was entirely the gospel message that convicted him of this, that Christ had come for the lowest of the low. And he just spent his fortune and himself on enacting that. If you give me another one, I'm going to go to this. I'm going to go to the 700s, so a century or more after. There's a chapter in the book called the greatest European you've never heard of, and it's Alcuin of York.
Oh, I so hoped you were going to do Alcuin of York, because that's my neck of the woods. I'm on my father's side, I come from Yorkshire, so I love that.
Brilliant. So, I mean, did you know all about Alcuin before?
I knew the name, but I didn't know much of the story. So it was a sort of a bit of an untold history. So I love that chapter. So tell us about
he was the most learned. He was a lowly student from a kind of middle class, not high, but elite family, middle class family in Yorkshire. And he went to the York School, which was the most prestigious school. where he just excelled in all of the liberal arts and then became the main teacher of the school. But it was on his journeys to Rome to collect more books, because he was a voracious reader, that he came across Charles the Great, good old Charlemagne, who was, conquering everything that moved and breathed. And Charlemagne basically said, you shall come here to Alcuin. And Alcuin sort of toed and froed. And a couple of years later, sure enough, somehow, we don't know the details, Charlemagne convinced him to come and basically set up throughout Europe a school system to train boys and girls, rich and poor, in the liberal arts. And during his time, sort of 20 to 30 years, given all of the power of Charlemagne behind him, Alcuin set up scores and scores of schools throughout Europe that lifted the whole of Europe to learn the liberal arts. Now, Alcuin was a passionate follower of Jesus Christ and had a wisdom view of education. That is, all knowledge of the world is more discovery of the wisdom of God imprinted on the world. So that means we have to learn arithmetic. We have to learn astronomy. We have to learn grammar and rhetoric and music and philosophy. And he insisted that students did, and he lifted the whole of Europe as a result. This is really the beginning of the cathedral schools, which are the beginning of universities. It all comes from Charlemagne's power, but Alcuin's genius and commitment to Christ to educate the masses. And the only other thing I'll say about Alcuin is that he's known as the only man who could contradict Charlemagne. And he did. In the late 700s, Charlemagne was killing the Saxons. He'd had a long 30-year battle with the Saxons, and they would pretend to convert and then revert to paganism. And so Charlemagne got to the point where he would just say, baptism or the sword. That's it. Get baptized or face my sword. And he was brutal with the Saxons. But Alcuin, we have 2 letters from Alcuin pleading the royal court to follow the way of Christ, which is only the way of persuasion. You can only bring people to true faith in Jesus Christ through gospel persuasion, sweet apostolic persuasion. And it's just a remarkable reminder of what the gospel can do in big power when it dares to speak to big power, the gospel. And we know that Charlemagne changed the law the very next year, in 789, to have a moderate policy toward the pagan kingdoms. He still went on and conquered because he was a good conqueror, but he didn't he didn't pursue this line of converting people with the sword, which he'd been doing for 30 years, and it was all because of Alcuin.
Fantastic. So yes, I always like to hear of a great Yorkshireman. It makes it. As we this may not translate to Australia, John, but over here it's funny. There's a saying, up north, that you should never ask someone if they're from Yorkshire, because if they're not, you will embarrass them deeply, and if they are, they'll tell you within the first 2 minutes of the conversation anyway. So anyway, from two great heroes, well, now let's flip it the other way, because your book looks at both the good and the bad. So as you looked over that sweep of history, who are perhaps the 1 or 2 standout sort of bullies that you were shocked by? Perhaps you didn't know the story that really made you pause and weep. We need to be honest about the dark stuff too. So who would you include on that list?
Again,
I know there are many.
It's so hard. Well, look, I'll tell you who it isn't. Constantine.
Interesting.
I mean, I've got 2 chapters on Constantine, and I think it's one of the great myths that's quite detached from history, that he sort of made the empire Christian. He actually had a policy of toleration. He just legalized Christianity, supported them, but allowed paganism also to flourish. I'm not going to include Constantine. That's the cheap answer. Oh, well, as soon as Constantine became a Christian, it's all downhill from there. I don't think that's true. However, shortly after Constantine, I think there are some really despicable characters, and that might be too harsh. But I'll mention Ambrose of Milan, who is a stunning example of a muscular Christian, the first great muscular Christian. Ambrose was a Roman senator. He was then the governor of Milan. So this is just a Roman secular governor. And he is parachuted in from that position to be the Bishop of Milan, which was a come down. And we're still in a period in 370s, 80s, where, bishop has nowhere near the authority or prestige of the governor, of a Roman governor. But he takes it because he's a devout man. But he acts as a bishop like he's a senator and a Roman governor. And he is pretty brutal. He approves of the burning down of synagogues. He bosses the emperors around. He removes pagan statues. He doesn't allow heretics to use church property, and some of that is valid. And the thing I always have to remember when I start talking down about Ambrose is that if you actually asked a poor family in Milan in this period, is Ambrose a bully? They'd say, don't be ridiculous. He's the champion of the poor, because he was. It's just that he used his power to champion the poor and completely sideline rich pagans, and remove them from government and sideline them from society. So that's one. He's a very mixed example. The other is Bishop Cyril of Alexandria, not to be confused with Bishop Cyril of Jerusalem, who was a legend. But Bishop Cyril of Alexandria is the dude under whose leadership poor old Hypatia, the greatest female philosopher of antiquity probably, and one of the greatest philosophers per se in the early 400s, anywhere in the Roman world. She was the great pagan philosopher in Alexandria, and because of Cyril's political machinations, he created an environment that led to her disgusting mugging and murder and cutting up into pieces and burning by Christians, led by a reader of the Bible, Peter the Reader. So the person who's charged with preserving the scriptures and reading the scriptures in the Church of Alexandria, he and his thugs murdered this wonderful woman. It had nothing to do with her being a woman. It had nothing to do with pagan education. It was really to do with politics. They feared that Hypatia was supporting the governor against Bishop Cyril. But nonetheless, it was disgusting. And you read the sources and you just think, how could someone who names Christ possibly do that? The interesting historical quirk is we only know about this terrible thing because Christians recorded it and said how terrible it was. Right? So it's not like the non-Christians said this and the Christians are saying, no, we didn't do it. It's Christians who tell us this event happened.
Yeah. One, in terms of bullies, John, one example you haven't mentioned, I know you talk a bit about the book, is the one when often skeptical friends raise some of this, sort of darker side of history with me, often the ones that are pulled up. We mentioned the Crusades, but particularly the witch trials and the Inquisition. Are often given as as examples of where things went really badly wrong. But I'm intrigued in the book. I get the sense you don't think those are the worst examples in Christian history. But can we just talk about those for a moment? Because those are the ones that people will often mention.
Sure. Well, for one thing, the Crusades were a giant failure.
Yeah.
So Muslims never remembered the Crusades as the bully Europe taking advantage of us poor Muslims. That's a recent flip of the whole story. The Crusades, apart from the First Crusade, the Great Massacre, and then for about 2 generations, they ruled Jerusalem, but they were pretty soon booted out again, and never took the Holy Land again. Right, so Muslims remember the Crusades as a failure and proof of the weakness of Christians. Right, so I'm not sure you could include that. They were brutal like all war, but they just weren't either on the scale or the success that we imagine the Crusades might have been. As for the Inquisitions, it's the thing that's really puzzling is, as despicable as they were, the idea that you would torture someone over beliefs or practicing witchcraft or whatever, as brutal as they were actually regarded as the fairest courts in Europe. And we have records of people trying to get out of the secular judicial system into the Inquisition, because everyone knew the Inquisition followed all sorts of rules of evidence and actually gave you multiple opportunities to repent. And if you did, your fine, as it were, was penance. Whereas if you got found guilty in a secular court, chances are you'd be brutalized, put in prison and forgotten about, or just killed on the spot. Now, the Inquisition did kill between 5,000 and 6,000 people. This is the best research to date that we have, over 350 years, 5,000 to 6,000 people, so 18 a year. But that 18 a year wouldn't even match, any particular secular court in a year. It wouldn't rate a mention in the history of human violence. These are terrible, awful blips. And most people who went to the Inquisitions were set free, and if they're found guilty, but they repented, they were set free with all sorts of penance. Say the Our Father over and over, and whatever. But we also know the prisons of the Inquisitions were super well kept, and you got a meal every day, and that wasn't to be taken for granted, because you wouldn't get that in the secular prisons. So it's hard, because it sounds like you're justifying them when you point this out. All I'm saying is they were wicked, but in a fair history of human brutality, they wouldn't make the top 100.
Yeah. I think one of the things that intrigued me, there's a lovely little quote, actually. It's such a lovely little quote. Actually, I want to read it to you. Read what's your own book, of course, but read to listeners. There's a lovely point you make on page 281, where you talk about the temptation of our age, is to elevate our particular time and place as the crescendo of human purity and achievement, and thus speak ill of the past. I think there's something in that doesn't mean as Christians we don't talk about what's happened, but I think there is this tendency in our age to think we are the sum of all virtue and all of the past is terrible. But John, look, we've got about 10 minutes left, so there's a couple of kind of key things I still want to press into in our last few minutes together. So you've done you've given us a sort of a brief overview in the last few minutes of some saints and some bullies in the book. You obviously do a lot more, go into huge detail. What would you say though to a skeptic, whether an angry skeptic or just a fair-minded one, saying, okay, you've done a fair overview, but this ultimately sums to zero. You've got the negative guys, you've got the positive guys. So put those numbers together, we have zero. So quite frankly, it would make no difference whether the church was there or it wasn't. Yes, it's done some bad things, yes, it's done some good things, but overall, it wouldn't make any difference had it never happened. How would you respond to that critique?
It's a fair instinct. And the fact that I don't do a tally in the book leaves me wide open to that suggestion. But I just felt it just doesn't make any sense to say, we were 4/5 bad and 4/10 bad and 6/10 good. The thing that I would point out is when inquisitors are torturing people in Christ's name, are they following what is plainly there in the Gospels as the teaching of Christ, the model of Christ? Are they following it, or are they departing from it? And I think anyone can tell at 100 paces that they are departing from it. So what's the problem with a brutal, violent, torturous Christian? It can't be their Christianity. It's their departure from Christianity. So that's the first thing I'd say. You've got to compare it to the original composition, to Christ. The other thing I'd say is these brutal actions are the norm. They are everywhere. You didn't need the church to start wars. Rome and Greece were doing just fine on the war front before the Christians came along. You didn't need the Christians to have torture. The Romans, had torture built into their legal system. And when Christians do those things, they are acting like everyone else. The unique contribution of Christianity to the world is not torture and war and bigotry. They are human universals. So you've got to ask, what is the unique contribution of Christianity? Where did they leave a contribution that is different from the norm, from the base of humanity? And the answer to that is in charities, hospitals, education for all, the fact that everyone is made in the image of God and therefore equal, and therefore human rights, which emerge from canon law, not from the Enlightenment. Thank you very much. 600 years before the Enlightenment, church lawyers were saying the poor have inherent rights against the rich. And so our whole tradition of human rights comes from that. So these are the unique things, because you didn't find them in Greece or Rome. So I think a fair account of history says, well, without Christianity, we wouldn't have had these things we now love and take for granted. Hospitals, human rights, charities, education for all, and so on. These were unknown in Greece and Rome.
It's interesting you say that. I remember watching a debate last year between another historian, Tom Holland, whose work you'll no doubt be aware of, and A.C. Grayling, very well-known British atheist. And Grayling, it's very interesting, Grayling was sort of going through history, picking out all these wonderful examples from history that he liked, that he felt we didn't need Christianity for. And Tom's challenge to him was, well, where did you get the idea that human rights and justice are a good thing? The very filter through which you're picking these things out from history is actually a profoundly Christian one. And that brings me back to almost my last question, John. Is there something interesting? And we must never use this as a gotcha, but I think it's a potential gospel pivot, that when our atheists and skeptical friends challenge Christians on this, what I found interesting is, of course, it's exactly this. It's to the standard of Jesus they're calling us. They're saying the church has failed to live up to. So even our most strident critic is ironically actually calling us to be more Christ-like. Is there something quite powerful in that very observation?
Exposing the hypocrisy of the church is just a continuation of the Jesus tradition, because anyone who picks up a gospel sees him doing just that, exposing the hypocrisy of the religious. And the standards by which they're judging the church are the standards of Jesus. Why didn't you love your enemies and treat everyone equally? Well, where did you get that idea that people should? It certainly didn't come from Greece and Rome. It didn't come from the Enlightenment. It was the standard teaching of Jesus Christ and the apostles and the church fathers and all the way through the medieval greats. They all knew that was the standard. The beautiful tune, which is the theme, sort of the theme of the book. Jesus wrote a beautiful tune. It's the gospel. It's his teaching of love of enemy, but ultimately it's his embodiment of that love of enemy in giving his life on a cross for the world. That's the beautiful tune. When Christians kill and hate in Christ's name, they are not singing the tune. They are departing from the tune. And we all know you've got to draw a distinction between the beautiful composition and the crappy performance. If I tried to play you Bach's cello suites, you would, hear you'd hear a terrible performance. But if you hear Yo-Yo Ma play the cello suites, you hear the cello suites played as they're meant to be played. And that's the point. Christ wrote a beautiful tune, and Christians have sung it beautifully at times and terribly at other times. We just need to be honest about that.
John, that's a great place to bring it to a close. So thank you so much. Appreciate you taking the time to join us all the way from Sydney. And so to remind folks, we've been talking about John's book, Bullies and Saints, an honest look at the good and evil of Christian history. There will be links in the show notes to various places you can buy that book. Hugely encourage you to take a look. I say it's a fascinating. One of the things I like about it, John, it also reads really well. History can be dry and dusty, but John, you tell a great story as well. It's a very, very readable book. So do check it out, whether you're a Christian wanting to be able to engage with your friends who ask this question, or if you're watching this and you have no faith in Christ and the issue of the church and history has been a bit of a sort of stumbling block for you, do again have a look at John's book. John, once again, thank you very much, and
thanks, mate.
And all the best in whatever you're working on these days. So bye for now.
Thanks, mate. Bye-bye.